So tonight's presentation, we're going to be covering three very different types of uses of epoxy in woodworking. And the three different presentations that we're going to be showing tonight kind of build up on each other. The first one being fairly simple and something that all woodworkers can use. The second one being more artsy. And the very last utilizes some of what you learned from the first two presentations will be being able to make a river table. All of these presentations were put together primarily with materials and tools that are readily available in most woodworking shops, with the exception perhaps of the particular epoxy resin, which you can easily get online. What I wanted to do was not go into special tools, special processes that are not available to most. So this should be something that every single person's call would be able to do. It's going to be done primarily through video, which will be stopping the videos along the way to be able to answer questions. Questions can be answered, can be asked through chat. We're going to be muting everybody on this call because with the number of people we have on the line, it's just going to be too much of people talking over each other. So during the presentation, go ahead and just submit your questions to everyone. By doing that, everyone can see the questions and we'll work to try to answer as many as we can. With that said, I think it's important to talk a little bit about our sponsor, Total Boat. Total Boat, for those who are unfamiliar with them, has become a major and important player in the world of the maker community and the woodworking community. I've been using their products exclusively for the last year and a half to 2 years and have been extremely happy with them. And they provided the epoxy materials, mixing cups, dyes, and other things that I'm using in the majority of the presentation, which I'm showing. Anything that, the questions you ask, I'll answer what I can. Specifically, I'll probably answer questions about some of the techniques and the molds that I use and materials, but very important is we have Paul Hyde on the line. Paul Hyde is one of the technical experts over at Total Boat, and we're very, very lucky to have him on the line with us. Paul, I'm going to quickly pass the baton to you in case there's anything you'd like to say before we start the presentation.
Okay, yeah, sure. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'd like to say thanks to everybody for showing up. As he alluded to, I'm a member of the tech team, and we have a really good, dedicated team that our sole job is to provide, information about these products. So, and we have a lot of tools, online. You can call us during weekdays. We have a team available. Questions about products, techniques, all that sort of thing. And you may get somebody who doesn't know the answer, but they'll say, "Oh, let me bounce you over to somebody I think who does." And then we also have online means of contacting us. But then we also have a lot of support right on the website itself. There's a lot of really good information to be found there. We have a support section where you can just type in a keyword and there's thousands of articles in there. If you haven't been to Total Boat, the Total Boat YouTube page, go there, and the videos just go on and on and on. And we have a lot of great ambassadors that we work with that bring a lot of interesting ideas to it. So that's one of the big things that I think makes Total Boat different is the support you get backing up the products. So with that, I'll be happy to help with any questions, and looking forward to seeing your presentation.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to jump right into it. Again, like I said, most of this is going to be shown through video with occasional pauses. The first one is actually, it's going to be about 15 minutes. It's a presentation on gap filling. And the reason it's taking 15 minutes is I'm covering a significant number of tips, tricks, and techniques. And any questions along the way, please remember, share them in the chat with everyone, and we'll pause the video along the way and try to answer them as we go. So with that, as long as I technically am not going to screw anything up here, I will be sharing a video, which I'm going to be kicking in right about now. A lot of times we can end up with wood from multiple sources that have cracks and checks or voids for all sorts of different reasons. And often we need to discard those parts of the wood, but sometimes not only can we salvage the wood, but we can even accentuate it and taking advantage of those cracks and voids. What I like to do is fill those voids with epoxy. If they're little teeny voids, I'm able to use something like a 5-minute epoxy, but typically for larger cracks and checks, I'll go ahead and use a really good, high quality, flowable, slower cure epoxy that's not thick, that gets into every single crack and crevice that's out there. For an example, I've got a few things here. I've got this log, which I had acquired, a piece of pecan, which I took slices out of. And you can tell from the slices that there's all sorts of terrible cracks and checks on it. However, this wood, which is kind of a salted pecan, is absolutely spectacular. I don't want to lose this. By filling in the crack, I'll be able to go ahead and accentuate those marks, make it part of the wood design, and be able to use these boards just like I would any other board that I have. The first step before being able to pour any epoxy is to go ahead and seal off the areas on the bottom and the sides to make sure when you pour the epoxy, it doesn't run out. I like to just go ahead and use good old blue masking tape. It works really well. It helps to make sure you have a good flat surface you're working on. What I like to do is look and see where the crack is the largest. That's where I'm going to pour into. On the back side, I'll go ahead and cover this up and also the sides. Make sure you really rub the tape down strong. It's important to make sure that if there's any leakage at all, it just stays contained right where you want it. Same with the side. And what I'll often do is go ahead and fold it over on the top to make sure it doesn't come loose. I've still got a gap there where I'm able to go ahead, and when I pour in the epoxy, it'll go right into that gap. But now I've got a nice little pocket here that'll prevent any spillage for that particular crack. I'll go ahead and get the other one. If there's any sort of debris in the cracks, I recommend trying to get it out. For example, I've already cleaned it out, but there was a little bit of dirt and barkish type material that was the inside. I went ahead, cleaned out what I could with a little bit of a screwdriver, and I actually took a hacksaw blade and slid it into the crack in order to try to get all the loose stuff I could out, and then I blew it out with the blowgun. Nice thing is that there's still a little bit left in there. The epoxy tends to soak into it, and then go ahead and seal it up with all the rest. So you end up with a good solid covering anyway. Okay, it's time to go ahead and mix up the epoxy. I'm going to go ahead and use Total Boat. They have a high performance epoxy, which is perfect for this. It flows really well and it dries extremely hard. It's obviously designed to be able to also be used as a glue and with fiberglass and to build boats. For woodworkers, though, this is really kind of a go-to for just about everything you do with resin. I like using the slow hardener. It flows really well. It gives it time for everything to flow into place before it all hardens. It takes longer, but it works so well that I just don't like messing with anything else. I just like sticking with it. Now, for me, I like to go ahead and tint the epoxy, and I usually tint it black. Black looks really well. It looks like good thick spalt lines, and it doesn't draw the eye and look fake when you do that. I find if you try tinting with something like browns, a solid hunk of brown just doesn't look like something you typically see in wood, but for some reason black doesn't stand out as an oddity. Almost always I use this stuff called TransTint. Most of us are familiar with it. TransTint black, all it takes is a few drops to mix in with the epoxy. However, I've discovered with lighter color woods, like maple, for example, and poplar, being a dye, that when you pour it in, it tends to flow through the cracks and can extend a little bit beyond it and leave kind of a black haze on both sides of the crack. To avoid that, I learned this trick, which is to go ahead and use black grout, non-sanded. Non-sanded grout is an extremely fine powder. It mixes in, but because it's not a dye, it doesn't spread. So it doesn't soak into the wood and therefore doesn't leave that haze. You don't want to use too much of it because you don't want to have it to thicken the epoxy, just enough to make it dark enough, so that way you end up with the black finish. Now I'll go ahead and I'll show you. This particular set of epoxy is awesome because it comes with these pumps. I don't have to worry about measuring. It's a 2-for-1 ratio. So I'll just go ahead for now, and I'm going to give it and 1, 2, 3. If this is boring, just go ahead and count with me. 4 and 5. Okay, now I know I have the right ratio. You want to mix it for 2 to 3 minutes. I'll probably go ahead and speed up the video as I do this. But I'll tell you right now what I'm going to do is get it mixed up. I like to go ahead and mix it before I put in the grout to kind of guarantee that I have no issues with it and so I can see what's happening. When you mix it, make sure you mix it and stir up all sides of the cup. You'll notice I have the cup at a bit of an angle. By having it at an angle, it allows me to go ahead and have the epoxy flow to one side as I'm working it, which prevents me from having an unmixed buildup on the bottom of the cup. So for me, this has worked really well. And I'll go ahead and speed up the video now as I continue stirring. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of the grout now. I like to add just a little bit at a time to see how it looks. You'll notice everything is all mixed up. It does have a little bit of a haze to it because it's got some air bubbles in there. Those will work themselves out as this sits. I'll go ahead and I'll add some grout right now. Just a little bit of powder to start with. And I'll go ahead and mix that in, see how it looks. You'll notice it didn't take that much. It's turning black very fast. You want to make sure it gets in there really well. And again, scrape down the sides. I used so little that it did not impact the viscosity of what I have here, but it did turn it very dark. One thing though, don't let how dark it is be misleading. It's better to look and see how dark it is on the stick, because you could see that it still is fairly translucent. Sometimes it's not an issue, but I'm going to go ahead and add just a little bit more just to be safe. That should do it. All right. Once this gets stirred in, I like to let the epoxy sit just for a little bit to get some of the bubbles kind of rise to the surface and get out before I pour it. By doing that, there's less likely there'll be bubbles in it when it's in the cracks, and you end up having a really smooth surface left behind. And you'll notice that that's now much darker That'll be perfect right there. Okay, I thought I'd pause here. I didn't see any questions come in, but before we get into the pour, I wanted to see if anyone had any questions at all, if you could put them in for everyone about the use of the epoxy, the use of grout versus dye. And dyes do work well also, depending on your situation. So the working time with the epoxy, to answer that question, is the instructions say to mix for about 2 minutes. And what I'll usually do is I'll mix it for about a couple of minutes, let it sit just for a little bit. However, if you are mixing a very large quantity, it's very important that you don't let it sit in the cup for too long, because if you let it sit in the cup too long, heat builds up and will end up curing faster than you would like it to. So that is something to keep in mind. There's also a question about the red blue. It actually ties in with the color caps that are on the bottles. I want to make sure I don't mix my caps, and one had a blue cap and one had a red. So just to remember, I put that in the bottles. It's just a little something for me to keep up with things. If you're not using the pumps, it's very simple. The total boat works by volume, and it's, in this case, it's a 2-to-1 ratio, I believe. Actually, I take it back. This is a 3-to-1 ratio. So
No, this high performance is a 2-to-1.
It is a 2-to-1.
High performance is 2-to-1. Yeah.
2-to-1. So it's by volume. So you could just measure out 2 ounces of one and 1 ounce of another, or however much you're making. And that's the way I have done it in the past before I got the pumps, and I've never had trouble with it.
Hey,
Yeah.
Doug,
One last thing, if I could just, I have my volume up, but if I had some people saying they thought that I was running low on volume. Just a quick note, does the volume sound okay? Tom, what do you say?
I'm hearing you just fine on this end. No audio issues at all. I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure. What other questions have you got for us? And Paul, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, when he's done, I do have a couple of comments I'll mention about the pumps and the measuring as well.
Okay,
sure.
Earl asked the question, is it okay to use grout with all of the different types of epoxies? Both products are just high performance.
I don't know if you have an answer for that, if you've used it yourself, Paul.
Yeah, actually, this is the first time I've seen grout used. I thought it was a good idea, interesting idea. So I'm going to say it depends on the viscosity. It sounded like it was a little gritty when you were mixing it. So I'm not sure how large those particles are, or how fine those particles are. I think it would be fine for the high performance or for the traditional 5-to-1, the tabletop. When you start getting into the deep casting epoxies like the thick set or the Fathom, those tend to be a lot lower viscosity by nature. So I suspect that it would tend to settle out, which is actually common for a lot of different pigments with those because they're so low viscosity. So the trick to that is let it set for a little while and then go back in and re-stir it. And when it starts, as it cures, it starts to thicken. So you can kind of go back in there and re-stir it.
That's a good point, Paul. I tend to use the grout for smaller things as it is, and I don't tend to have issues as far as time goes. The unsanded grout is a very, very fine powder, extremely fine. So although it sounds a little gritty, it really is. It mixes in just beautifully.
Okay.
And I've had absolutely no issues with it any time. And if you have a darker colored wood, you can use traditional mica dyes and the TransTint like I showed in others, and they all work just fine. But in order to prevent that bleed through, especially if you're dealing with end grain, the grout minimizes it significantly. And when I learned that trick, I haven't gone back. So I hope that answers it.
I have another question here from Gary. He says, what's the red and blue?
Yeah, and I think I answered that before. I had to do with the color of the caps that were in the bottles. That way, if I put the caps back on, I just remember which is which. Because since the caps have a little bit of the the resin and the hardener on it, I don't like to mix my caps. And Towboat's great. They provide caps are different colors, so you don't mix them up, but I can't always remember which is which. So I just write it on the bottle. Although they're actually good enough, you'll notice that the lettering on the bottles are blue and red also. So, you know, it helps.
A couple more questions. Marty's asking, what is the working time of epoxy?
I'm going to go ahead because I can talk about my own experiences, but Paul can answer that on numerous levels. So I'm going to pass on to him.
So, okay, so working time there's a lot of variables to working time, and they mostly revolve around temperature. So if you're working in a cool space, you're going to have a much longer working time than if you're working in a warm space. And then as he mentioned, the depth of the epoxy is also a factor, because as the epoxy is curing, it's generating heat. So if you have all that epoxy in a large full container full of epoxy, it's generating heat, and that heat is feeding itself, and you can actually get what's called an exothermic reaction, where it runs away, and the next thing you know, you've got a little miniature Chernobyl on your workbench, only maybe without the radioactivity.
Okay.
So the key thing is how much you mix to affect the working time, and what your temperature is. One cool trick that no pun intended, or maybe it was intended, is people will they'll take like a bucket of ice and mix up the epoxy, and then set the mixed epoxy on the ice to help keep the epoxy cool while it's reacting, and help, gives you a bit longer working time. There is a tech sheet on the website. So when you look at the website, underneath the description of all the products, there's an area down below of frequently asked questions, and in between there's a couple of links that say tech data and safety data. And on the tech data, it will break down the working time for the various hardeners, because we have the fast, medium, and slow with the high performance. So for example, the slow that he's working with here, they list a few different numbers, and these are typically all measured based on a 77-degree temperature, sort of a mid-range temperature. And so it will, the slow will start to gel in about 40 minutes, and it'll become tack-free in about 5 hours, and a full cure is about 5 days. It doesn't actually specifically mention pot life here, probably because of the variables involved, but
yeah, it depends on how much you have in the pot, which makes a significant difference.
Yeah. So, and it's possible. So, for example, when you're doing like what Doug's doing here, you can mix it in small batches, and that's one of the convenient things about the pumps is you can just do a couple of pumps and mix up a small batch, and then pour it, and then do another couple pumps, and mix up a small batch and pour it. However, when you're doing that, if you're trying to keep your color consistent, you kind of want to mix up your various batches of, some cases, some people do different colors, for example. So they'll pour out a little bit in each cup and then mix their colors and then use that. Another thing you could do is once you've done your big mix, you could transfer it to a series of smaller cups. But if you want to keep your color consistent, you kind of want to do that large batch first, get your color the way you want it, and then maybe either do something to keep it cool or transfer it to smaller containers to keep it from overheating. Or the other way you can do is to spread it out so the depth isn't that deep. So instead of putting it in a 1 quart cup, maybe you put it in a paint tray or something, and that allows it to dissipate the heat more quickly.
Very good. I'm going to go ahead and finish out this video. I was just now trying to.
One other thing. Sorry, I forgot the.
Yes,
I mean,
please.
but I meant to mention about the pump. So, like, I noticed when you're pumping, like, the hardener goes down real easy, but it takes a little bit of effort to get the resin to go down. Part of that's the difference in viscosity, but it's really important when you're pumping to make sure that you do full strokes with both of them. And the pumps are metered, so it's just 1 pump of hardener and 1 pump of resin. I can't tell you how many times I get a phone call saying my epoxy's not curing. And I'm like, well, how did you mix it? So I did 2 pumps of resin and 1 pump of hardener. That doesn't work that way. The more accurate you can get You can't like add a little bit extra hardener and get it to cure fast or something. The more accurate the ratio is, the better it's going to cure. So, you know, just make sure you do full strokes with the pump, and that'll make sure your measurements are accurate. And as you mentioned, you can do it by volume. You can also do it by weight. It's a little different when you do it by weight, which is also spelled out on the tech sheet.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate all of that. We have a few more minutes of this video, and then we got plenty to cover on the next two as well. So I'm going to jump ahead. I do know there were a couple other questions. There's a question about bubbles. I'm going to cover that in the next session. But you'll see when I pour a little bit of a height. By doing that, it helps to kill the bubbles as they're going into these little cracks. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. Just carefully let it go in. By pouring it like this at a little bit of a height, it also tends to break up the bubbles as it's pouring. Going slowly in there, and it's just filling in the voids. I can tell you now that I probably don't have enough mixed right now to get all of these cracks filled in at the moment, because it's good to have extra to pour on the top when you're done. But I'll just mix up a little bit more. That won't take much of an effort. And talking about color match, it's important also to make sure you go all the way to the edge. Quickly, talking about color match. When you deal with all black like this, the color match isn't really an issue.
Yeah, it's easier. Yeah.
I'll go and continue. Put this here so you can see what's happening. This part here where there's a crack, it's almost microscopic once it gets to that end point, and it's hard to see. So I like to just pour extra all the way over and beyond. You'll also notice, possibly, based on how good the video is, that this is not filled all the way to the top. The glue has managed to soak in, it's worked itself through, and I'm going to go ahead and pour a little bit more. Okay, filling in that valley. As the glue continues to soak in, I'll come back later and see if I need to put a little bit of a topper on it, so to speak. I'll go ahead and I'll get this thinner one right now. You will see later how well this went to the very, very thin cracks, even with the grout. It didn't have the grout had very little impact on the viscosity. What you'll want to do is check back on this in about 15 minutes and see whether the epoxy has soaked in and has left more valleys. If it has, you'll want to come back and fill them in. It's better to have too much than too little, because when this is all done, you're going to come back and sand or scrape or plane this, the extra amount off the top. But with all that I poured, you'll notice I've already used a significant amount of it in here, just for these two cracks on this piece. I'm going to go ahead and put this down. Okay, it's now the next morning, and I let the resin harden overnight. It's really important to make sure the resin hardens up as much as possible. Makes it a lot easier for sanding or planing off the excess. As you can see, I went back after the last video session and poured extra. Looks a little messy, but that doesn't matter. That whole layer is going to come right off. Like I said earlier, it's better to make sure that you have too much than too little. And I like to make sure that there's enough that it actually bubbles up over the top to guarantee that when it comes off, you have no dips or valleys inside of where the resin was placed. It's very, very hard now. I've got the tape here in the back. You notice in this case, no leaks. I'll go ahead and strip some of this off and let you take a look. You can see that this resin has worked itself completely through from one side to the other and along this crack as well. So now this is completely solid. There's absolutely no gaps in there, and it looks like it was like this all the way through. Let's go ahead and take the rest of the tape off, clean this up, and I'll show you how I go do that. Okay, I'm going to answer a few questions that came in before we do the final cleanup. There were some great questions, really good questions that came in. One of them had to do with what if you didn't pour enough and you need to go back and add more after the epoxy is cured. You can. One thing to keep in mind is that if it's just a small valley, you'll want to get over there and scuff it with something like 220 grit sandpaper in order, if you can get into it to that point, in order to make sure that what your leveling amount of epoxy put above that will adhere to what's below it. If it's only a half full crack and it's really deep, you can't get there to sand, but you don't really need to. The epoxy will adhere to the sides of the crack and you should be fine. But you're much, much better off trying to get to it before it fully cures. If it is hard, but still tacky, that is optimal. You're able to go ahead and pour at that time without having to worry about how it adheres. Cracks are a little different than if you're dealing with things like river tables, which we'll talk about later. And we'll go into second pours for the river table, and you'll learn more about that. Another question that came in had to do with how do you keep the dust out of it? Well, with the crack, you don't really care because you're overfilling it on purpose. So there's a bit of a dome over the top, and that's all going to get sanded off and planed off, as you're about to see that I'm going to be doing. And the last question I noticed had to do with wood movement. It's a great question. What I have found is that by placing the well, let me back up. Your wood should be acclimated. This is not the type of a process. You don't tend to fill cracks using epoxy or anything else if the wood has not been fully acclimated. So if it's a fresh cut board, you need to let it sit in your shop or your storage until the moisture works itself out of it. Just like all other wood in any other situation, working with epoxy has nothing to do with that. You always want to make sure your wood has been fully acclimated, and so that the moisture, the humidity level in the wood is basically the same as it is in the air. And that's a whole other class about how to do that. But in general, if you let your wood sit for, like a piece that's an inch thick and let it sit for, 6 months in your shop, you're not getting in trouble with that. However, the good news is that I have found that once you use the epoxy, it is the best that you can use to fill cracks, because if there's ever a little bit more movement that tends to take place, the epoxy is glue. It holds everything together. In fact, I use epoxy instead of woodworking glue if there are gaps in my joints, and it's really good if you end up with sloppy joints to get rid of that slop. Just another quick tip. It works better than if you use anything else, like like a lot of the wood fillers. They will tend to crack a little bit, but the epoxy won't. I'm going to go, anything else quick to add to that, Paul, before I finish out this particular video?
No, I think you covered it really well. One of the cool things about the high performance is that it is a little bit more flexible. So it has a little bit give with it. So if it's being pulled, it will move a little bit and makes it less likely to shear and crack.
That's really good.
That's what makes it stronger.
Thanks. I appreciate knowing that. I did not realize that as well. So thank you for that. Okay, I'm here at the planer. I'm going to go ahead and take some very light passes to go ahead and remove this extra bulk of resin off the top of this piece. This is one way of doing it. The reason you want to take light passes is that since the resin can be a bit brittle, if you take heavy passes, there's a chance that it'll chip out a little bit as it goes along. I like to take several passes along the way, and you'll see the results. Other options include using a belt sander, orbital sanders. Just go ahead and use a really heavy grit, starting with something like 60 and then working yourself through. I'll need to sand this obviously once it's done going through the planer, but let's go ahead and take a look and see how this turns out. Okay, here are our filled in cracks. I'm going to go ahead and just give this a light sanding and then a quick splash with some mineral spirit so you could see the final results. All right, a quick splash with a little mineral spirits. And you'll get a feel of what this will look like once it's sanded a little bit better and has a complete finish placed on it. You'll notice that the black absolutely pops along with the rest of the grain. And you end up with a really beautiful accent to your wood. There it is. Perfect results. All right. All right. Let's see. I'm taking a quick look at questions and I'll be jumping on to the next. What about cleanup of pumps and the cup? So the pump and the cups, you know, some of them are fairly, the pumps are never an issue because you're not mixing the different parts together in the pumps, so they tend to stay clean. However, in the cups, you know, the stuff does harden. So by using the plastic cups like the ones that Total Boat provided me, and you can get other brands as well, but you know, you can get them straight from their site. They what I tend to do is I tend to leave a little bit of the resin in the cup with my stirring stick. And then once it cures, I can pull the stick out. Most of the epoxy comes with it. I usually won't use it to mix up another batch because there could be residue left in there, but the cups are still usable for other things. There's another question, which has to do with resawing the boards. I do it constantly. I will fill in thick cracks like that.
An example there.
Oh, there you go.
If you get in front of the camera there, but that's same process. You can see how the epoxy stuck to the stick, and then pull the stick out, and it just comes out in one great big piece.
Yeah, it's great. I have had some really good luck with that. The best thing to do actually is you wait until it's hard, but not 100% hard, and then it's a little flexible and tends to pull out almost like rubber in some ways. Resawing the boards, not an issue. Because of the technique that I've used, the epoxy fills in every single gap and hole in there. And when I resaw, I end up with really nice thin sheets, and I've done that quite a bit. I will say that if you do find that there's an air bubble stuck in there, you just mix up a teeny bit and fill in the bubble and sand it down. It's very, very easy to do. And is it necessary to do a seal coat when doing a river table? I'm going to cover that. You don't need a seal coat necessarily. I'll just say this quickly. You don't also need a seal coat over the resin itself, but the technique I use, you do put a seal coat on there to provide the shine and translucency of it. And I think I'm going to cover more detail regarding that particular question later on. And Kelly, who asked that, if I don't answer your question later, please let me know so I can cover it for you. And I'm going to go ahead and jump on to our next topic. The next one is a funky one. This has to do with alcohol inks. For those who've never used it, I'm going to show how using a mold and a little bit of resin, you're able to go ahead and create a really unique art piece. What you're going to see is the first time I've ever tried it myself, and I think the results turned out amazing for a first time attempt. So I'll go ahead, pull this up so you can see what I'm talking about. And I'm just going to run this one all the way through, and then we'll take questions at the end if there are any. This one's less than 10 minutes. So I'm going to get the video ready for us now. And then I will share. Oh, it popped down. Here we go. Sorry about the delay. Let me try that again. The video stopped on me here. Thought I would show how you're able to use epoxy resin for artistic casting. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and cast resin inside this really simple wooden frame that I made and put a design in there. frame will later be able to use as a top of a box. It'll have what almost looks like a colorful stained glass effect inside of it. In order to do this, you need some sort of a mold or something to hold your pieces into while you do your pours. In this case, I just have this plastic container, and the resin should be able to pop right out of it very easily. I'm going to go ahead and use Total Boat's what's called thick set casting resin. This stuff is great because usually with the traditional resins, you don't want to pour more than about 1/4 of an inch. As resin cures, it gets hot, and as it gets hot, the heat can cause bubbles and warpage within the resin. So for that reason, typical resins, you only put about 1/4 of an inch in, and it doesn't get too hot. The thick set cures at a slower rate at a lower temperature, allows you to put thicker amounts in. And in this case, this is only about 1/2 of an inch. And with this, you can do probably about 3/4 of an inch without any issues. So this is what I'll be using today. The other thing I'd use to decorate everything is this stuff called alcohol inks. Resin dissolves in alcohol. Alcohol is a solvent. So alcohol inks are really unique because when you put these in resin, they end up spreading out in ways that are really unique and permeate throughout the resin and blend in unique ways. We'll see how it turns out when I'm done. Okay, I mixed up the resin and I let it sit for about 5 or 10 minutes. Letting it sit for a while is a good idea because it allows bubbles in the resin to start coming to the surface and breaking away before you do the pour, so you have less bubbles to worry about. I've got my frame sitting inside my mold. However, because wood floats, you want to make sure that you do something to secure it so it doesn't float out when you do your pour. What I've done is I've taken a couple of scrap blocks, I covered the tips with packing tape, so if any resin gets on there, it'll just pop right off and it won't stick to my final piece. I'm just going to go ahead and hold these in place with a couple of spring clamps. Once I've got this in place, I'll be ready to go ahead and do my pour. Okay, we're ready to go. Not much to it. I'm just going to take it. I like to pour in a thin stream, so that way it helps to loosen up and break any bubbles that might be in there as I do the pour. There we go. I've let this. I'm pausing just for a second to tell you. You'll notice I didn't scrape out the excess epoxy that was in the cup. You're able to do that, but sometimes you have unmixed parts of epoxy left in your cup. So usually I just pour out everything I can. I don't try to scrape out the rest, because when doing a project like this, you want to make sure you don't have anything that isn't fully mixed up in your going into your project. So if you have a little bit left over, that's okay. You're better off doing that than ruining your project. Oh. I've let this sit for a few more minutes. A lot of the bubbles have come to the surface and popped on their own, but I'm going to go ahead and get rid of just a few that are left. Got my torch here. I'll go ahead and light it up, and you'll see just do a quick sweep. All right. That's all it takes. The bubbles have been popped. I know you can't see them in the video, but trust me, they're gone. And now I'm going to go ahead and start playing around with the alcohol inks. Start with a little bit of yellow. You can see how that color is spreading pretty rapidly, and it has leaving a little bit of a haze between them. Going to put a little teal on top. For those who don't like my color choices, recognize I am not a painter. Now the next day, this thing is all completely hardened. It's ready to pop out. I'm going to go ahead, tap it on the tabletop here, manipulate the plastic a little bit. Let's see if this thing comes out or not. Perfect. Popped right out. There it is. Next step is to go ahead, cut off the excess around the edges. Okay, now that I've gone ahead and cut this, you can see it looks like quite a bit of a mess. However, once I sand it all down, it's going to look terrific. I'm going to start this off with a coarse grit, work myself down to about 220 on the belt sander. Then I'm going to move over to the random orbit and continue going to probably about 400 grit over there, and then decide what I want to do next. So one thing to be careful about is when you're doing this is that you don't want to generate heat, since resin softens up in heat. So you want to be light with your touch, and occasionally feel the back. Make sure that doesn't feel like it's warming up. Okay, I actually sand it down to about 320 grit. You'll notice that I sprayed down between grits with just a little bit of water and wiped it down to get rid of any of the residual dust. Now I'm going to switch over to micro mesh pads. For those who don't know, micro mesh sells pads that will fit onto your sander. So I'm going to go down through some of the grits. I don't need to get this to be glass smooth. I just need to get it close. Okay, next step is to go ahead and polish it out. I'm going to go ahead and use this ultra high gloss plastic polish. This particular one is made by Hut. It works well. Almost any polish that's designed for plastic, automotive work, and such will work. Okay, there's the backside. Nice and shiny. So here it is, ready to go in the window, use this little box, or anything else you could think of. It was a good, simple, easy, fun project, and one that I recommend you try in your own workshop. So there were a couple of questions. A really important one was asking would you use a heat gun instead of a torch to remove the bubbles? And I know that Tom had answered that he has used a heat gun and it works well in breathing also. One of the keys is that carbon dioxide helps quite a bit. For me, I prefer the torch, but you have to be careful with it to make sure you don't overheat the resin. And as far as what works best, I'm going to defer back to Paul.
I think it's a matter of choice. One of the handy things about the heat gun is depending on the type of project you're working. So for example, quite frequently they'll work with more than one color, and a common thing that's popular is like a sort of a charcuterie board or something like that that has what looks like waves washing up on a beach, and they'll take some white, some blue pigment and put a layer down and 2 little strips of white, and then work it with the hot air gun, and that kind of blows it out like, so it looks like the waves. And then just a little spritz of alcohol on top of that gives it sort of a cellular bubbly effect, and you get this very realistic looking surf scene. So you can use it, or if you're working with a tabletop epoxy, for example, you can use that hot air to kind of spread the epoxy out over the table and get a uniform coating.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate that. Someone had noticed I did not use a release agent. I actually wanted to talk about that. I had one in the image, but I ended up not using it because of the plastic I use. But for a release agent, it's also called mold release. I actually have one right here in front of me, which I'm holding up. And I do highly recommend it, but I didn't talk about it in the video because I ended up not using it. But I do highly recommend that when you're working with molds, whether it's supposed to be a nonstick surface or not, to go ahead and spray with the mold release. And it just helps to guarantee that whatever part you have pops out of whatever you're working with. You don't need much. It's a light spray. And you can find this on Amazon and other places. I don't know whether Total Boat sells mold release. Do you know, Paul?
We do have a mold release. I don't think it's the CRC. I think ours is more of like a paste wax, I believe. There may be other, and we also have PVA, which is another.
That's great. And I've done that too. I have used just really simple wood wax. I'll use it in my molds in order to help things pop. But I'll tell you, if you've got a good good clean, like simple plastic like I use there.
Yeah.
And
polyethylene works excellent.
Thank you. And the mold release, I think you should always use it if you have it. And there's a question about, is there a percentage of additive to the resin ratio? You find to be very, very little of the alcohol ink in order to have an impact. You obviously don't want to use so much of it and just spray it in there that you end up diluting the resin to the point where it won't cure. However, you would have to use a lot to do that. You will find that with just a small amount of that ink, you will have an impact. If you just want to color the resin, it works really well. It gives a very, very light hue to it. And it's very translucent. If you're going to use it like I did, it's just a few drops that make the difference as far as how it works. I was also asked what polish I use. The brand I use is called Hut. I actually bought that for pen turning because I will create resin castings for pen turning, which is something that if there's an interest, people can let me know. We can make that another class at some point. But it's very good for polishing out for pen turning, and I found it works well for this type of work as well. I don't see other questions, so in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead. Let me see real quick. Any others? I don't believe I missed any. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, where can you find the alcohol dyes? The alcohol inks that I have actually came from Total Boat, and it was a really good set. They didn't manufacture them, but they did have them available. So if you're buying your resin from them, you can take a look about the alcohol inks. And if you don't see what you like there, then you can go ahead and you'll find, if you just search for alcohol ink, you'll find that they're sold all over the place. They become very common. And what's interesting is that if you're working with very thick castings, the alcohol ink actually sells some that are designed to either float more to the surface or sink to the bottom. So you can change almost a three-dimensional effect while working with it. I use the thick, I want to point out, I use the thick set casting resin, which allows you to pour, 3/4 of an inch to 1.25 inches, I believe, and Paul will correct me if I'm wrong. If you're pouring more than 1/4 of an inch of resin, you should not, you should use something that's more of a thick set. They tend to cure a little bit slower. They don't get as hot, and they allow you to get a little bit of a, but if I thick, they don't mean thick as in it's thick when you mix it. It's thick as you can have something that's thicker when you do your pour. When I'm about to show the the presentation on the river table. I'll let you know right now that I made a mistake that is not shown. And that is I poured it's a 3/4 inch thickness altogether, which I'm going to go through. And I did it in 2 pours. That means I did a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch. It's not recommended, and Paul, please correct me if I'm this, but it's not recommended, and I've been told this, to not do more than about 1/4 of an inch of a pour of the high performance because it can overheat. And mine started to overheat. I got very fortunate in that it didn't heat up to the point where it damaged the resin, but the resin did actually start to smoke. And if it got just a tad bit hotter, it would have actually probably possibly cracked or warped on me. So just I want to be very honest about that when you see the video when I talk about this. Try to keep your pours to no more than 1/4 of an inch. And I can jump into the video shortly. And while I pull it up, Paul, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. There are limits. For example, the high performance, if you use a slow hardener, you can pour it deeper than if you're using, say, the fast hardener. You can get away with a deeper pour, but it would be a smaller amount. So for example, you're filling a thin crack in a thick piece of wood, you can, like you did the first video, you can fill that pretty deep. But if you're doing, the larger or the more mass of epoxy that you have, the hotter it's going to get. So if you're going to do a large area, you're better off to do it in thin layers than to try to do it all in one shot. Oh, also, by the way, there's somebody else asked about doing the seal coat. Is that in the next video or?
It is actually.
Okay,
it has to do with well, the seal coat, I wasn't sure if they were referring to the wood or the resin itself, but it's a good point. With the mold that I did, you tend to, and I'm going to talk about it and show it in this next video. Just basically sealing the wood to ensure that you don't end up with air bubbles coming out of it while the resin cures is a good idea based on the wood that you're working with or whatever else you're pouring into. So I'm going to cover that in this next one. And if there's more questions, please let me know about that. I'll go ahead and start this up now. Epoxy river tables have become very popular and they're pretty simple to make. Basically, you just get natural edge board, split it down the middle, reverse the 2 sides, and fill the center with epoxy. I'm going to go ahead and show you every step along the way now you can make one of these for yourself. When choosing a board, you want to make sure you've got a natural edge that you could work with, maybe look a little bit interesting. This happens to be a piece of walnut that also has a lot of sapwood in it. I think the variations will make it a little bit more unique. It's got checking down here on this end, which you're going to want to get rid of. So I want to make sure that I'm at least getting rid of that. And up on this side, you end up hitting all sapwood starting here. So I want to avoid that because that doesn't look quite as interesting. The panel I'm going to make today is only going to be about 2 feet wide, although obviously you can make a table as wide and large as you'd like. But this will probably be used more for end table, and it's going to be approximately 2 feet. So looking at this, I want to take advantage of this curve that's here, and a little bit narrow section here. I'll probably start the table right about here. Although it's hard to see, this is the heartwood in this section, and that gives me some nice variation on the edge. Going approximately 2 feet brings me to about here. That'll be the table. I'm going to go ahead and cut it an extra couple inches on each side. That'll give us a room to make sure when we plane it, we are able to cut away the snipe, and also a little extra space in case I need a little bit of extra space when squaring up the edge, which you'll see later. So I'm going to go ahead and make my cuts here and along this section there. The next step will be to plane the board down. Problem is, it has a little bit of a twist in it. It wobbles on the table. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and first cut it in half. Then it'll have less twist in it, which will be there for me to remove. And it'll be easier for me to run this through the jointer first, being narrower pieces, and then through the planer. So I'm going to go ahead and pick where I want to go ahead and slice it. And just looking through it, I want it approximately in the middle here, and approximately in the middle just before it narrows up too much, probably right about here. So I'm going to go ahead, put a nice straight line through here, and then I'll go ahead and use a jig that I've got for the table saw that allows me to cut rough edged pieces. After these pieces have been cut, you'll get an idea of how they'll fit together to create what's going to look like a riverbank edge. I'm going to go ahead, flatten out both sides on the joiner and planer, and when I'm done, I'm going to talk to you about how we handle the bark. The best way to take it off is whatever works for you. Sometimes you get lucky and big chunks will just pop right off. If they don't, you can loosen with the hammer, use screwdriver, pry bar, chisel, whatever works for you. All right, I've sanded the edges down to 220 grit. I purposely left a lot of the coloration on there in order to give it a little more visual appeal. But I did have to make sure I got rid of all the bark and the Camden layer that was below it. I don't really need to sand down any more than that because all of that's going to be completely covered with resin. The goal is to just make a nice, smooth, visually appealing surface where there also won't be any room for air bubbles to form. The next step is to go ahead and cut 90 degrees to this edge over here. Go ahead and pick where I want it. I've got a square. I'm going to go ahead and cut one side first. Once I'm comfortable with where it looks on both of the pieces, I'll cut both of them to exactly the same length, and then we'll go ahead and fit it into the form. The next step is to go ahead and prepare the mold. I've already cut the pieces so that way when they fit in there, it'll work out rather well. I have side pieces. These are melamine as well. That'll go right up to both of the edges. And these two end pieces, one is going to go ahead and slide right up to the edge to line up nicely. Once I've got everything lined up and the board's in place, I'll take the last one and I will secure it nice and tight up against the other edge of the board. But the first step I need to do is to wrap all the pieces in Tyvek. Tyvek is used for typically for sheathing that goes around the outside of the house and stuff doesn't tend to stick to it. For that reason, you don't actually have to use melamine, but I like to use it because it's nice and flat, easy to work with, no grains to get in the way, and the Tyvek sticks to it rather well. Now that all the surfaces that are going to come in contact with the epoxy have been covered with Tyvek, it's time to put the whole form together. It's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and first mount the two sides and one end all the way on one edge. After I'm done doing that, I'll fit everything else to get the last piece in place. First thing I'm going to do is go ahead and screw the two sides to the end piece. Then I'm going to go ahead from the bottom and screw all of that to the main base. All along the way, I'm going to put a very, very thin line of silicone between all the joints. I don't want much because I don't want it to bulk it up, but I want enough to make sure that nothing seeps through as the epoxy is poured. I'll go ahead and I'll do that now. I am going to pre-drill all the holes to make sure that I don't end up splitting any of the form or causing it to bulge out, which could change the shape of the final pour. I'm pausing real quick because I want to point something out that I don't talk about and I should. After I drilled the holes, I actually have a countersink sitting in my drill bit right now. And I just go in just a tiny bit with the countersink. When you drill holes, the hole can bubble up just a little bit. You know, it leaves a little bit of a bump. To make sure I have a perfectly flat surface, I go back over all the holes that I pre-drilled and use that countersink just like a 1/16 of an inch down to get rid of that bulge. Also, when you screw all the pieces together, it helps make sure that a new bulge doesn't form. So just a nice little tip that I don't talk about. I'll go ahead and continue the video. If you're wondering why I use so many screws, is because that makes sure it pulls everything in tight around the entire perimeter, really minimizing the risk of having any leaks. So between having perfectly flat surfaces, a little silicone, tightly screwed down, I don't think we're gonna have any issues here. Okay, wiped off any excess silicone that might have squeezed into the surface here. Now that I've wiped that out, it's time to get the very last piece fit into the form. This is going to be form fit right to the wood. So I'm going to go ahead, place the panels in place. And now that they're here in the form, I can take the last piece, figure out where it needs to go in. I'm going to go ahead and mark that on the form itself. Now I can pre-drill the holes, get the side screwed in, and then I'll get the rest of it from the bottom. We need to figure out how much epoxy we need to pour in order to fill up this void. But now would be a good time to quickly stop and ask questions before I move on to epoxy regarding making the mold and the wood itself. There was one question I want to make sure I answer for everyone, which is asked about leaving the bark in place. It's something I don't recommend, and it's almost always removed. Once you put the epoxy in place, the bark can separate from the rest of the wood just as easily, whether the epoxy is there or not. So there is a chance that you will end up with the piece breaking apart. It is possible, I suppose, or I haven't ever done it, to be able to go ahead and once you're done making your panel, mount the entire thing over a solid board to try to hold it together. But then you run the risk of wood movement being uneven and creating other issues. So for that reason, I don't believe that bark is ever a good idea to leave on there when making these. And if anyone knows otherwise, feel free to just respond to everyone in the comments. I see no other questions, so I'll go ahead and continue on with the video. We need to figure out how much epoxy we need to pour in order to fill up this void. To do that's fairly simple. We're going to calculate cubic inches and then convert it to ounces. So measuring this out, it is about 22.5 inches. And looking at the different distances here, we'll say it's an average of about 6.5 inches across, and the wood's 3/4 of an inch thick. So figuring that out, 22.5 times 6.5 wide times 0.75 tall, that comes out to approximately 110 cubic inches. We're going to go ahead and divide that by 2 because we're going to do this in 2 different pours, which leaves us with 55 inches cubed. If you go to Google and type in 55 cubic inches to ounces, it comes back and tells you that it equals just a little more than 33 fluid ounces. That's really easy for us to work with, and we'll be able to go ahead and figure out how much to mix now to go ahead and create our table. It's extremely important that this entire form is perfectly level in all directions. So I've already pre-cut some shims and I've been checking the level, and I've discovered that I do need to go ahead and put a few in a couple different places. And once I've done that, I've noticed that everything looks really good all the way around. Before we go and pour a lot of epoxy into this table, we're going to go ahead and seal the wood where it's just on the edge. So that way, later on, when we do a larger pour, we end up with really no chance of bubbles coming out or issues as the epoxy tries to soak into the wood at that point. So you don't need much. I'm just going to go ahead and mix up a little bit of this. I'm using the Total Boat High Performance Epoxy, and I'm using a slow hardener. The slow hardener is really good for tables like this for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is, of course, it gives you more time to work with the epoxy as you're mixing it and preparing colors and the rest. The other is that as you pour it, epoxy heats up, and if you use a faster hardener, there's a chance that with a thicker pour, you could end up overheating the epoxy, causing it to fail on you. It can crack, it can bubble, it could warp your frame by being too hot. Right now, I'm just going to go ahead and mix up this little bit. What I like to do is after I mix it, is I'm going to let it sit for just a couple of minutes to allow the bubbles that are in here from the mixing work themselves out, and then we'll go ahead and brush it onto the edges of the wood. I'm using a disposable brush in order to go ahead and put this on because whatever brush you use is going to get ruined. And all I'm doing is painting it on almost like you would be putting on a thick finish. This will go ahead, seal the edge of the wood. You don't really need to get on the top because that's all going to get sanded off later once the table is done anyway. The seal coat of epoxy is hardened up. If it's hard but a little bit tacky, then you'd be in excellent shape to go ahead and pour the first layer down. If it's completely hardened up, like if you let it harden overnight, then you can get something like a fine grit sanding pad and lightly scuff the edges. You'll need to do that to make sure the next layer adheres to the epoxy that's already cured on the wood. Of course, you don't want to pour thick coats of epoxy all at once because it could overheat. we're going to do this in 2 pours. And we figured out earlier that we're going to need about 33 ounces of epoxy per pour. So I'm going to go ahead, mix this up, and we'll go ahead and get ready to go ahead and give the first pour. I've stirred this for about 2 to 3 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and add some pigment to it now. I'm using stuff called Black Diamond, which is a almost metallic-like pigment. It has a great shimmer to it. Let's see how it turns out. All right, as you can see, this has a great shimmer to it. Should look terrific when I pour it into the mold. I like to add it from one end going to the other, raising it up some and pouring in a bit of a stream. So that way, while it streams out, it ends up breaking up some of the bubbles that are still left inside the surface. Most of the bubbles, if not all, should work themselves all the way up to the very top. It's important after mixing this to make sure that you get it in fairly quickly, because while the epoxy is sitting inside the pot in a large volume, it could heat up rather rapidly and preset on you. I'm going to go ahead and just add a bit of a waviness to it to add a little extra visual interest. Kind of give the impression of water flowing through a river. I've let this sit for a few minutes and bubbles are now rising up to the surface. They may not all pop on their own. So in order to get rid of them before we go ahead and get ready to pour the second layer in after it hardens, you're able to quickly just take a blowtorch and really fast and rapidly pop the bubbles with the heat. You don't want to heat up the epoxy. The goal is to just pop the bubbles. The second layer can be poured once the surface is solidified a bit and it's still a little tacky. If you wait for it to completely harden, you'll have to scuff the surface before pouring the next layer. Well, I didn't get a chance to get the second pour on this before it fully hardened, so I went ahead and scuffed up the entire surface with the fine sanding pad. Now this is done. Gonna go ahead and repeat it. Gonna mix some epoxy, put some dye in there. I'll be stirring it up for a couple of minutes and pouring it into place. I'm stopping here for a moment because I had a few good questions that showed up. I gave a couple answers, but I thought I'd answer them for everyone together or watching in the chat. One question that came up had to do with why I didn't have to secure the wood to make sure it doesn't float out like I did with the previous project. The reason being is I only filled this up about halfway, so I didn't have to worry about the wood floating out. That said, if I was using a thicker set resin, or if I had concerns about that, I could have clamped it in place. And if I was filling it all the way, I definitely would want to clamp that wood down to make sure it doesn't float. I did have a question about using pre-made molds, and do silicone molds work well? Yes, silicone molds are excellent for using with resin. It's harder to find them larger. They're extremely expensive when you get them that large, but they can be used. People do make molds for tables about this size and larger. You can find them online. if you don't want to do your own. I find it's better to make your own because you can make them to perfectly fit the wood, which is actually, it's actually trickier to cut your wood to perfectly fit the molds. But if you don't have the tools or the ability to go ahead and make your own, you can go ahead and get pre-made ones. Just go online and you can search for, so you can just search for them online and you'll find them. And one thing to keep in mind is a mold like I did, screwed together, can be reused. So that also works out well. Someone asked also about what's the recommended wait time between the pours. The recommendation is to, there are a few ways you can check on that. If you wait until the resin has started to harden up, is tacky and thick, you can actually put a second layer on it. You can wait overnight. You can wait until it's completely hard. Then you have to scuff the surface, which is something that I talked about as well. And people who have infrared thermometers can take advantage of it. I actually have one. I didn't want to show it here in this video because most people don't. But you can monitor the temperature. You'll see the temperature go up as it's curing. Once the temperature stops going up and starts going down again, it means that the bottom layer has already started to set. So if you let it start going down some, you can actually pour the next layer. But you have to be careful because if the bottom layer is still rather loose, you don't want that to mix in with the new layer. So it's best to just wait. The safest thing to do is wait until it starts to harden and still feels tacky, and then pour the next layer. That's a guarantee good way to do it. And another question has to do with when you add a second color. So it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to, mix colors together to create swirls of the sort, you want to, I have found, and I'm going to ask Paul for his input when I'm done answering it, in case he has some advice as well, because people do it different ways. I found that for me, a faster set works better for that because it thickens a little faster and you mix up both pots and then you wait a little while. And when you feel the epoxy just starting to warm up, you immediately pour them in and swirl them around. And then the two will mix together and it'll end up setting in a way where the colors don't mix too much. I have had problems in the past where I would pour in two different colors together, but because the epoxy, if I'm doing a slow cure, might sit there for hours on end before it cures, the colors all mix together before everything forms. So if you do a yellow and a blue, you just end up with green. Paul, do you have any additional insight on mixing different colors with pours like this?
Yeah, I think you got it right. It's just a matter of the viscosity of the resin. Whether you mix the colors and then let it sit to a point where you can add them in different layers, or whether you pour one and let it thicken up a bit, and then you can come back and you can add either swirl-ins or streaks or however you want your pattern to look. I have seen one kind of interesting technique where, for example, they wanted to put some thin lines through it, and they took a tongue depressor, poured a little bit of tinted epoxy on the tongue depressor, and then kind of swirled it through the epoxy, and it winds up leaving a thin trail behind it. So you can do very fine lines with something like that. But you definitely want to have some viscosity to the base epoxy before you try that.
It's a really good point because if you do it right when you do the pour, those thin lines will just dissipate very fast. You would want to monitor because once it starts to go, you don't really know when necessarily, but then when it goes, you know the timing's just right. And you just have to monitor it. And then there's a question about to be safe, wait for it to fully cure. Are you asking about the sanding after the cure? Oh, for fully cure between. If you let it fully cure, the first layer, if I'm seeing your question correct, Denise, If you wait for it to cure completely, there's no problem with that. You just need to scuff it up with something like 220 grit between the layers, and you won't see that. When you pour the second layer, it'll just completely fill in all of the scratch marks and it'll be transparent. There's no problem. You do want to blow out any dust that's in there though, that's left behind, and wipe it all clean before you pour the second layer. And Indira had asked what kind of epoxy was used. And the answer to that is I used a high performance epoxy here. The reason I used the high performance epoxy instead of the thick set was because some people, if they're not used to the thick set and take some practice, may end up not judging the viscosity, the temperature, the thickness properly. And it was actually recommended to me for initially creating these to go ahead and do thin pours with the high performance. And as I mentioned earlier, I did end up pouring a little thicker than I should have, and it got a little warmer. So if you use the high performance, be sure to keep it down to 1/4 inch or thinner for each layer. I should have done this one in 3 layers. I was fortunate that I didn't have a problem. And fast or slow or fast high performance, I use the slow. I just find it safer. You have more time to work with it. And it just tends to flow beautifully and adhere very, very well. You can use the fast. I will say this, if you are in a very cold environment, then you're better off using the fast performance because it's more likely to cure and cure a little better. If it's 55 degrees in your shop, and Paul knows this much better than I do, Paul, I'll let you talk about when you should use the fast versus the slow.
I think it's like you said, when you're working in lower temperatures, another subtle difference between the fast, the medium, and slow is the slow is the clarity is much better in the slow than it is in the medium or the fast. You can actually you might see a slight yellowing to the hardener as it ages. So once you've opened that bottle and kept it for a little while, you might see that the fast and the medium will turn a slight yellow. When you mix it with the resin, it's not that noticeable, but like if you poured it out like on a sheet of white paper or something like that, you might. So if you're going for clarity, slow is definitely the way to go. But the temperature and the other, this is also a product that's used for laminating and things in boats repairs and things like that. So sometimes it's more beneficial to have a fast setting hardener when you're working on a vertical surface or something like that, and you want it to set up faster. You thicken it and shorten the cure time.
Thanks, Paul. That's actually a really good point. And for those who want to use the epoxy for more than just river tables, the fast is actually really good if you're using it as a glue, which, by the way, I do often as well. A lot of my projects, I'll use epoxy instead of wood glue for larger projects because there are times for the strength and for filling in gaps. If I'm doing a very large project which uses biscuits, I'll sometimes use the epoxy instead. You'd be surprised. That could be a whole other class in itself as well. There are a lot of great questions that came in. So I mentioned the thermometer. It's a non-contact thermometer. They sell infrared thermometers. You just point a laser light at something and it pops back and tells you the temperature. You can find them from Harbor Freight, relatively inexpensive, although they may not be the most accurate. From there, they will give you a feel of whether the temperature is going up or down, and you can find even better ones, but they're relatively inexpensive. I was asked if the multiple layers will show up when you look at the side view. If you're be careful to use about the same amount of the pigment in all of your pours to make sure that your colors match. If you have a light layer and a dark layer, they will definitely show up. But because of this particular pigment, which has swirl patterns and such already in it, I have found that I could not see the difference at all when I did this. And it just, the sides just ended. You don't see a line on the sides when you use the same amount of pigment for all of it. And
If I could just interject on there
yeah,
too,
please.
a key thing for that is a dust-free work environment, which I know it's hard to achieve. But if you're letting that layer cure and some dust or settles on it, and then you do your next pour, you might actually see that as a thin line in the between the layers.
Well, that's a good
So,
point. And earlier there was a question about keeping dust out, and I didn't talk about that, and I should have on the last one. I made sure that in my shop that I hadn't created sawdust for a few days before I poured this. And you can also get a large piece of cardboard and lay it over the top to help keep dust out as it cures. So in fact, it's a good idea to do that to try to make sure you don't have a problem. And for other projects that use epoxy-based like tabletop finish, they code finishes for people who have seen those, like bar top finishes. It really helps to make sure you're in a dust-free environment, because you don't tend to sand the final piece when you do that. There's a question for you, Paul, regarding does Total Bolt sell a very thick set, for example, 4-inch pours? Do you have a product that does that?
we have a product called Fathom, and that's a new product. It's definitely thicker than the thick set. I don't think it achieves 4 inches, but again, it depends on how large an area you're doing.
So Paul, why don't you look up the
I'm
text?
pulling that up.
Yeah, you can put that into the comments to everybody as we continue on, once you find the answer to that. But it's good to know. And if you could put the name in the chat as well, that would be great.
Yep. I'm gonna. I think I can. Can I copy a link into the chat? Does that work?
I honestly don't know. You can give it a shot.
Give it a whirl. Look at, there's the link for the tech data sheet.
Great.
And it's a couple pages long, and this is a fairly new one for me.
Yep, the link does work.
Yeah, there you go.
Thanks. And then I'm going to go on and answer a few more questions.
Go ahead.
Thanks. And someone had asked about why you scuff between finishes once fully hardened. Epoxy will end up not necessarily adhering to different layers if you don't scuff between them. So if it's fully hardened and it's shiny, just like the plastic, molds, the epoxy will pop out of a plastic mold. The two layers may not adhere very well. That light sanding with something like 220 grit sandpaper puts a little bit of texture on the bottom hardened layer, and the epoxy will adhere to it perfectly well, no issue when you do that. And then it was asked about mentioning the actual ratios again. I'm assuming it meant mixing the parts. High performance epoxy, which I use, is a 2-to-1 ratio. So you just mix 2 parts of one to 1 part of the other. It's very clear. It's easily marked right on the canisters what's being done with that. I'm being asked about a 15-foot long, 1.5 inch conference table. Paul, does your thickset work fairly? Well, first of all, I'm going to let Paul answer that one, because I have not done a 15-foot table. So
Yeah,
I'm going to let Paul answer the best techniques that he's aware of for that one.
Yeah, so neither have I, but I do. One of my good customers is a company called Chagrin Valley Custom Furniture, and that's pretty much all they do are these huge boardroom tables, and their go-to right now is thick set, and then they will also do. I think they'll probably move towards Fathom for some of their stuff. They've got it pretty much down to a science. They have a controlled room and everything that they do it in, but they'll do it in layers. They'll do thick set and they'll do it in layers. So with some experience, you'll get a feel for how deep you can pour. But something like 15 feet, you probably wouldn't want to go the full inch. You probably would scale it back some and do it in several pours.
Yeah. I have a question here, which is a really good complex one about what happens if you do 2 pours and then you notice that the tint is different. So you see a line between them. Can you fix it by routing out some of the epoxy and creating a new well? And the answer is absolutely. Paul, if you
Yep.
want, I see you nodding.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, and there are other things you can kind of do. Like, for example, if you're concerned about that, and you know it's going to be an issue ahead of time, you can even just sort of, build a little dam in your river and fill your river, and then for your last pour, fill the ends. So with your last pour, you can fill an area that's deeper, that's not as large. So you can kind of have like a little, edge. Doesn't have to be terribly large, but you could have a 1/4 inch wide, 2 inch deep section at the end that you're filling when you do your top pour across the top. I've seen people do other things like that, where, for example, they kind of pre-fill the river with some other material to kind of fill the space that you weren't going to see once you fill the river. They pre-fill it with glue down some scrap wood or whatever, or in some cases they'll actually embed objects of interest in the river and make it clear so you can see the objects. And of course they'll you've got something interesting to look at, but you're also saving how much epoxy you need because it's taking up some of that volume.
It's great. And clear is an amazing option for reasons I were just mentioned. And there's some people I've seen who created a bottom layer that looks like a water layer, like we just showed. Then they lay over it things like little fish and shells and such, and then a clear layer over the top of that. So you can get some really incredible views with that. And the thick set works well for those types of things. I was asked about routing. You can route resin very, very easily. You want extremely sharp tools though to make sure you don't have it chip out. Just same as with wood. You don't want it to burn, you don't want it to chip out. So if you have a router bit that's not going to give you a really clean cut on end grain of wood, you don't want to use that on your resin. Make sure your bits are sharp. Don't use high-speed steel. Use tungsten carbide bits. I find that works much better. And take lighter passes so you don't end up with any chip out. You're gonna actually see me put an 1/8 inch round over this later on, and I had zero issue with it. But people routinely will route any sort of edge, chamfers, large roundovers, coves, and I have zero issue with it as long as your tools are extremely sharp and that you take light passes. There's a question about mica powder that I'm going to pass on to you, Paul. This is from John, who said that he uses the mica powder, similar to what I just used here, to create the swirls, but as the epoxy cured, the swirls diminished. Could it be because he used too much, too little? Does it sink before curing? And just I'm familiar with this question. This was the same person that did thick pours. I believe it was a several inch pour that he had done.
Yeah, so that's that goes back to the viscosity of the product. So thick set, because it's a deeper pour, it's also much lower viscosity. It's actually quite, the name's kind of misleading. It's quite watery, and the advantage to that is longer cure time, so it generates less heat. But also because it's low viscosity, the bubbles come out and it comes out much clearer. But in terms of suspending the pigment, that pigment's going to tend to settle out. So you have to kind of monitor it when that viscosity starts to thicken up. You can stir up the pigment and sort of reintroduce it at that point. And so you kind of have to go back and revisit it and continue to mix it. I think this kind of gets out of the normal, the stuff you'd normally find in a shop, but I think there may be people use like vibrating tables or something like that sticks in my head. I've never seen it done, but I seem to remember hearing about it. And like it conjures up the images of, you remember the old football game where you had the plastic men, you line them up on the and then you turned it on and it vibrated and they went running and going across this. I'm thinking of that. I know it just popped into my head when I heard that, but I seem to remember somebody referencing that in the past. So I'm not sure if that's a real thing or not.
That's definitely getting to advanced, but we are talking about it. We have advanced woodworkers on here working on this. So I'm glad we're covering some more advanced questions as we go. And I'm looking, I don't see any others that I may have missed. I thought it was a good place to stop and just scanning real quick. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead in the video. I'm going to demold this and start finishing it up. And keep the questions coming. If enough questions come in, I'll go ahead and pause again before we finish the video and answer any final questions and have our amazing total boat giveaway that we have coming up. And thanks, Paul, as well for your help answering all these. The epoxy is cured overnight and this looks just amazing. You can see it's got amazing coloration to it. It's nice and solid. We're going to go ahead and take the mold off now. I'm going to be unscrewing everything. I might need to do a little bit of finesse in order to try to get this to pop out. And then next step will be sanding it down. That's a plastic wedge that I'm using, not metal. I'm fortunate enough to have a drum sander, which I'm going to use to go ahead and flatten both sides of the panel. Some people can go ahead and use a planer if they have one wide enough. However, I exercise caution when doing that because you could get chip out or cracking of the resin when you do it. So make sure you use extremely light passes. Other options include router sleds, belt sanders, random orbit sanders, CNC if you have one that's set for flattening. You can do almost anything you want to go ahead and get it flattened out. Just make sure you start with a coarse grit and then eventually work yourself down to the finer and finer grits. I'm going to start with the belt sander with coarse grit in there. Happen to have 80 in the machine. I'll be taking quite a few passes to flatten it out. Once it's done, I'm going to go to my random orbit sander to go ahead and sand it down to the final sanded finish. Now that the panel is flat, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the edges on my table saw before I go ahead and do a final sanding. To sand this smooth, I'm going to use my random orbit sander. I'm going to start with 80 grit and then work myself down to 320. Once I do that, I'll see how it all looks. And I'm going to move on to micro mesh and go through those grits probably down to about a 4. That'll give it a very smooth surface. It won't be glass smooth. We'll end up with a really perfect finish later once we apply a coat of polyurethane on top of this. I'm pausing here because this is the second time I mentioned micro mesh. I just wanted to indicate that not everyone has that and it's not a requirement. You can actually sand down to something like 400 grit. Once you put a finish over it, which you'll see later, that will end up getting rid of the, it'll end up looking really beautiful and smooth. So I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware that that's not a hard requirement, but it really does work well when you get that. And if anyone has any other questions about sanding, there was a question that came up, but not a question, a comment that Denise had, who I believe is speaking from experience. I mentioned all electric sanding, and it's true. Resin can be, especially larger projects, is not fun to try to sand down by hand, and it's really hard to get it perfectly flat. So it would be recommended to go ahead, if you have it, some form of electric sanding, at least to get through to your very fine grits. And then after that, hand sanding actually works just fine. Using a random orbit sander, I brought this down to 320 grit and then about 2 more layers down with micro mesh. Some might even consider that to be too much because you need to have some texture on top of the resin in order to make sure the polyurethane sticks to it. I'm going to use about a 60% poly, 40% mineral spirits to go ahead and brush on the bottom right now. I'll put 2 or 3 coats on the bottom first, then I'll flip it over after all that cures, and I'll work on the other side as well as the sides. I have a light set up right here. This light shines across the surface and makes it really easy for me to look at the glare and check and make sure that I've got a good smooth finish and that nothing is missing. It's time to see both the walnut and the resin really pop. Once this polyurethane makes it onto the resin, it'll suddenly become very transparent compared to the way it looks right now. Nice thing is, when working with resin, it's possible to sand it and polish it all the way down to a glass smooth finish, which is what a lot of people may do when they're working with only resin. But when you're doing this with wood as well, you really can't practically do that because you need to put a finish on the wood. So, as you can see, all the beautiful translucency and the bit of the swirl and the patterns that formed from that special metallic-ish pigments that we used cause everything to pop inside the resin as we go ahead and put the finish on it. Here it is, after several coats of polyurethane were put on both sides. It's now ready to go ahead and be mounted on legs or even put up on the wall like a work of art. This particular piece I created with no special tools or materials with the exception of the epoxy resin and the dye, which is easy enough to go ahead and find online. Also, you should know that I have a confession to make. I created this piece as the very first river table I'd ever created. If I can create this on the first try, it means you can obviously also. I highly encourage you to try this and other uses with the epoxy. You'd be surprised how much you can do with it once you go ahead and start playing with it. Okay, hopefully the music at the end wasn't too cheesy, but it really did turn out absolutely beautiful. We had some great questions that came in at the end here. One of them was asking, and I know that Paul had answered it already, but someone was asking whether it's better to use a coarser grit like 80 between the layers. It's really not necessary. 220 works great because all you need to do is just create a little bit of, at a microscopic level, a little bit of a coarseness that the different layers of epoxy will bind to. There's no reason to use anything coarser than 220. And I'm glad, thanks for answering that. I had someone allowed me to repeat what I used for my mix. I liked to use a thinner version of polyurethane. I think it tends to be rather thick coming out of the can. So I used about 60% poly and 40% mineral spirits to thin it out. That's really helpful for the first few coats as well, just because it soaks into the wood a little bit better. And once you get a few coats on, whatever you want to use works. I'll be honest, you can use just about any finish you're used to. You don't have to use polyurethane. It's what I use. I find that it works well for most tabletops. It's got durability and it does adhere rather well to the epoxy. There were questions about food safeness. I'm going to have to pass this on to Paul to answer that question about whether epoxy is considered food safe.
Some are. Tabletop epoxy is a food safe, and maker epoxy. So if you do your river table, you can do a thin overcoat with the tabletop on top of that. For smaller projects like a cup or a bowl or something like that, you could or charcuterie boards, you could use maker epoxy as well.
By the way, I've used the tabletop for other projects, and it's an amazing project. Yeah, a product. It just leaves this incredible thick, clear coat over everything. And on a project like this, it's actually a really good product if you want to have a built-up surface. Thanks for letting us know that. By the way, I covered polyurethane. So because of that, if the polyurethane is not considered food safe, it's not food safe. If whatever finish you put over the polyurethane is the finish, whatever finish you put over the epoxy is what needs to be food safe if you're putting a finish over it.
Also, one of the other questions that popped up there is why coat it with the polyurethane. Epoxy is generally not UV stable. There are some that have a little bit of UV protection built into them. Maker epoxy is one of them. Total Boat has a product called Crystal Clear, which is commonly used on wooden boats, but it still needs extra protection from UV. If it doesn't get it, it will turn yellow over time. So, and Total Boat has a number of different varnishes and wood finishes that they sell. There's a clear water-based polyurethane called Halcyon. There's a spar varnish called Lust, and another version of the spar varnish called Gleam. And what's interesting with all those products is you can do multiple layers of the protective coating and not have to sand between coats.
That's great. By the way, everyone should know I have moved a lot of my finishing to both Gleam and Halcyon. Halcyon is water-based and Gleam is not. But they are spectacular, and I've sprayed with both of them as well as brushed on. And if you want a thicker built-up surface, although we're not talking about that, we're not focusing that for this session, but just your word, if you're on the Total Boat site and you're curious about testing out new finishes, you can put multiple coats on in a single day to really build up your finish. 3 or 4 coats in a day. They cure fairly fast and they work really well. I've used them on outdoor furniture, for example, among other things. I'm looking for any other questions. Oh, Earl asked a really interesting question, Paul. It's something I've not done before, but I can brainstorm on this one. Any thoughts of using diffraction grating to achieve a holographic effect? Any thoughts on that, Paul? I have a thought that I could throw out there, but I wanted to know if you had any ideas or have seen anything like that.
Yeah, when it comes to holographic effects, I think I'm going to have to go to Obi-Wan Kenobi on this one. But I mean, I can tell you, I mean, there's a lot of things. One of the things that Chagrin likes to do is they'll pour, a couple of different colors simultaneously, and that results in like a gradient effect where it goes from like a lighter to a darker color, things like that. I'm not sure what diffraction grading is though.
One thing that's out there is something called dichromatic material. And you can get dichromatic plastics and glass, and it's basically a coating. You can get thin pieces of dichromatic plastic and you can cut them up into small pieces and put them in a middle layer. I wouldn't want the top layer. You put on a middle layer and get an effect. Or you can attempt to try to put sheets of it on there between your layers as well, Earl. So in fact, Earl, I would love it if you try anything like that. If you could, reach back out to me. You should have my info on how to reach me if you'd like through my website. And I don't believe I have missed any other questions. So I know it's gotten very late. So I'm going to go ahead and jump up with some final information here for everybody. And then we can also have our giveaway, which is for our members. So first, let me go ahead and share my screen with everybody. This is how you can see more of my work and what I do. I'm on Instagram at Doug Pisik. I'm the only Doug Pisik in the entire world, which makes it easy for me and easy for you to find me. I also have a YouTube channel. I don't put much out there, but I do put things out there on occasion, including a whole section on quick tips. And my website has some of my projects if you're curious about who I am, and it also has a contact me section. So if you want to reach out to me and if you have any questions, feel free to go to my website and click the contact section and send me a note. I'd be happy to follow up with any questions that you may have after today's presentation. I also pulled up totalboat.com where you're able to get the products we talked about. And Total Boat, as Paul mentioned earlier, has a YouTube channel. If you just search for Total Boat, they have a lot of people who talk about river tables. Some of you are familiar with Jess Crow. She is represented by Total Boat, and she is probably one of the most amazing epoxy artists out there. River tables just barely touch the surface of what that woman can do. And very important is who went ahead and presented this tonight is the Woodworkers Guild of Georgia. And as you can tell, all of you who, I think we had about 25 different states of people that registered today. As you can see, you don't have to be in Georgia to appreciate what we can do. We have about 2 years worth of prior full presentations on our website. If you go to, I mistyped it there, www, oh no, I got that right. Woodworkers Guild of Georgia, WWGOFGA. Woodworkersguildofgeorgia.com. You can go out there and learn a little bit about us, and you can also see if you're interested in becoming a member. You don't have to be in Georgia to reap some of the benefits, which I will get into now. We have an amazing giveaway provided by Total Boat. Thank you, Paul and company. This is a set of the high performance epoxy. It includes the pumps. It has some dye. We have mixing cups, a hat, even a sticker for those who share them, and basically everything you need to do a smaller project and be able to test out the epoxy and see if you'd like to make a table. So it's worth probably about $100 or more, but this is only available for Guild members. So sorry about that for those who are not, but it's an example of why it makes sense to join the Guild. We have a lot to offer. So I'm going to go ahead and let everyone know how to go ahead and be eligible. So for Guild members, you're to this already, go to chat and chat to John Champion. The 10th person to chat the phrase, which I gave at the very beginning of the presentation. It was a 2-word phrase, and I used it throughout the presentation. The 10th person that chats that to John Champion will be the winner. It is local, so for a local Guild member, and it will be available to either be picked up at my home or at our next live meeting when we start having those again. John will let me know who wins, and we'll make sure we get that to you. John, do we have a winner yet? And while he's looking, I want to thank everyone for coming and for asking amazing questions. For those that came in late because of some of the technical challenges that we have, I greatly apologize. Please accept my apologies and know that if you want to reach out to my website and ask for information you may have missed earlier in the meeting, I'll be happy to provide that for you. And I'm incredibly sorry that some of you couldn't join on time earlier on.
That would be Kim Murthersbow.
Kim, congratulations. All right, Kim will be sure to get that to you. And that is all for my presentation. I'm looking quickly for any last minute questions. I think we're good. And
yeah, there was one question in there about fluctuations of temperature, and I tried to rattle something off there kind of quickly, which is a good point. I mean, if you take anything and you flex it back and forth enough times, eventually it will crack. Fortunately, with these sorts of scenarios, I mean, we're talking about a very minor amount of stress that's going on in there. I haven't seen any like major delaminations that came from that. However, that does bring up the point about how important it is to make sure the layers are well adhered together. Because if you have two layers that aren't bonded well together and there's some kind of stress going on there, that would be most likely the first place for it to show. And if you get layers that delaminate, it'll actually look like you have bubbles inside your finish, like large sort of shiny surfaces. And then I've seen things where, for example, there was like an unknown void in the wood, and when it gets hot, the void, whatever's in the void, is expanding, and it forces its way out. Somebody sent me a picture not too long ago of some kind of mystery fluid leaking out of the bottom of their table, and it happens when it gets hot. So
those are good points. A lot of that ties in with just good woodworking in general, like trying to avoid voids and and understanding wood movement when you're dealing with wood. As far as the epoxy goes, the lamination issues and such you mentioned, I assume that those are extremely rare situations, and they might occur if people don't scuff the surfaces
exactly
effectively. If you do it, if it's not still tacky when you do your second and third pours, and you just have to scuff it. If you scuff it, odds are you'll have zero issues ever. People have made these tables and they've lasted for many, many years without any problem. That is it for the presentation part. I don't believe you have anything else to discuss. John, is there anything else before we say goodnight to everybody?
No, that's it. Thank you, Doug. Outstanding presentation, and judging the comments, everyone agrees with that. Just everybody come join us at our December meeting. More to come on that later.
Thanks so much. And again, anyone has additional questions, just feel free to reach out to me. Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Thank you, Doug. I expect to see your
you,
resume
Doug.
next week.
Much appreciated.
Sure.
Thank you, Paul.
No problem.
Thanks. Good job.
Paul, thanks for joining. It meant a lot.
Happy to help. That was fun.